My name is Ray Kopp, and it's my privilege to moderate this closing session today. We're going to switch gears a little bit. The title of the session is Broader Objectives for U.S. Climate Policy. Hopefully it builds on the first two sessions, which dealt with greenhouse gas reduction as the primary policy objective, both internationally and domestically. And really we talked an awful lot about one particular policy tool to achieve those reductions, which appropriately is a CO2 charge. But we're going to broaden the discussion a little bit today, at least this afternoon, and it's going to become a lot more interdisciplinary. I don't think we have any CGE modelers on the third panel here, so it's you don't have to worry about your understanding of those particular aspects. What we're going to focus on are the other objectives that might be embodied in proposals for domestic legislation to control greenhouse gases, other than simply controlling those greenhouse gases. There's an awful lot more going on in these bills, and so we do want to talk about some of those other objectives. We want to talk about some of the challenges that are certainly going to face the Congress and the President in designing this particular policy and passing it into legislation, and talk about some of the issues associated certainly with technology and innovation and all those things that are embodied in the current proposals that we see. And we have three excellent panelists to walk us through that discussion. On your seats you had bios of everybody. Let me just briefly introduce them to you now, and you can read a little bit more on those sheets if you wish. The first will be Nigel Purvis, who is currently is a visiting scholar at RFF and was part of the climate negotiating team when he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans, Environment, and Science in the State Department. And after that, Nigel served as a Vice President for Policy and External Affairs at the Nature Conservancy, where he was intimately involved in the forest carbon issue, which you heard talked about this morning. So we're very happy to have Nigel with us. Nigel will be followed by Linda Cohn, who's Professor of Economics and an Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies at University of California at Irvine. Linda's research focuses on economic, political, and legal institutions that bear on innovation within the United States, with a particular focus on energy technology. And finally, we have Bob Simon with us, who's staff director on the Important Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate. Bob coordinates the often difficult process of developing policies and passing legislation out of that committee, and played a major role in the passage of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And so we've got a real stellar lineup. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Nigel, and we'll follow the same pattern as we've done in the first two. After each presentation, we'll take one or two questions of clarification, and then we'll move on to the next presenter, saving all the substantive questions for the end. Nigel.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. It's a great pleasure to be here at RFF, and I mean that in two different ways. As Ray said, I've had the good fortune of being in residence here for the last few months, and I can say this is a wonderfully collegial place with a really high quality of researchers, and it's a real pleasure to also be with you here today, sharing with you the results of some research that I've done here at RFF on the nature of different kinds of international agreements, and specifically how the choice of the instrument that we make at the international level could affect our ability to achieve U.S. foreign policy objectives relating to climate change, as well as to secure U.S. participation. Much of my presentation will be based on a paper that is available on the RFF website that is a short title of which is called Paving the Way, the Case for Congressional Executive Agreements and Climate Change Protection Authority. I'm a lawyer, so I don't have a PowerPoint for you. I have no data. And I'm also a diplomat, and at the UN it's very hard to show a PowerPoint in the 5 official UN languages simultaneously. So I've learned to do without, and I hope that I can nevertheless keep you interested here, even without eye candy, and by giving you at least a couple of the conclusions that I've drawn recently from the research that I've done that may be a little bit surprising or perhaps even controversial, and therefore I really look forward to your discussion. One point, the Bush administration's climate change foreign policy, its current approach to international climate diplomacy, is not nearly as bad as most people who care about climate change think. And in fact, I would say there is very little difference between what a president Kerry would have done had he been elected and what President Bush is doing now, save one major exception: the level of effort, the amount of emission reductions that the current administration is prepared to pursue. Very different there, and that's a very important difference. But in terms of its architectural, structural elements of current U.S. foreign policy on climate change, it's actually quite consistent with where I think the political left in the United States would like to go, and I think that's newsworthy. The second point that I'd like to make is I think that we, despite that, are very much on the wrong track. We have two major processes moving forward simultaneously. There's an international negotiation which the U.S. has joined with the rest of the international community, setting a goal of concluding a new agreement that would take the place of the Kyoto Protocol, or at least pick up from Kyoto for the period after 2012. That agreement is supposed to be done by the end of next year. We have high expectations among some that a new Congress and a new president would pick up the cap-and-trade discussion that occurred just earlier this month here in Washington and really push that forward in 2009. And I think it's difficult observing both of these processes to conclude that the U.S. has in place both a process as well as a substantive policy that is going to make those two efforts align in the way that we need them to align. So that's hopefully a little bit of a teaser of where I'm going and reason enough to stick around for at least a couple more hours. So let me remind you of the question that Billy and Ray asked me to address, which is really what do we need to do as part of our domestic climate change legislation to ensure that we have a sound international climate change policy and that we're achieving our broader foreign policy objectives. And before I can answer that question to the best that I can, I think we need to get on the same page on three subordinate kind of background questions. Firstly, what are our climate change foreign policy objectives? Until we have a clear understanding and agreement on that, it's hard to know how we would design a domestic bill in order to get there. Secondly, to what extent is there broad political support in the Congress and among the political and influencing class here that those, in fact, are our foreign policy objectives, and how much political consensus has been built up around a set of principles? And thirdly, what's happening in the international negotiations? What are the expectations that other countries have about the United States, and how likely are we able to move those negotiations in the direction that would allow us to achieve our objectives? So let me briefly cover those things, then I will hopefully spend most of the time that I have here at the podium talking about two specific recommendations. One, that we should stop negotiating climate change treaties, and second, that we should make our domestic climate change bill much more outward-looking and view the domestic legislation as really our primary tool for engaging other countries. So that's a brief outline of the talk. Let me turn to those first three questions then. What should be the U.S. climate change foreign policy? Well, I think there are four things that the United States or the next administration needs to do. We need to create an international policy framework for cost-effective, equitable, and appropriate emission reductions. A lot of baggage in those words, particularly the word appropriate. What level of emission reductions are appropriate, I don't know, but whatever consensus we arrive at that, we need an international policy framework that ensures that the world as a whole will be marching toward that shared goal. Secondly, we need to promote technology research and development. I think it was clear from the discussions that we've had already that just a business-as-usual approach will not get us there. Many of these technologies are not currently available, whether it's carbon capture and storage from coal-fired power plants or a range of other transportation technologies that are just not commercially viable yet. So the government has a role to play, and that's not just domestically, where most of our R&D has tended to occur, but really as part of an international partnership with other countries. I would point to the ITER project, which is an international consortium of developed and developing countries that are working to create nuclear fusion in a facility in France for peaceful purposes for electricity generation. That kind of international cooperation on technology R&D needs to be a complement to whatever domestic efforts we have. The third objective and strategy really ought to be to accelerate the diffusion of clean energy technologies to rapidly emerging economies, the ones that are responsible, as we've seen from the various charts, for the lion's share of the emissions growth that we're going to experience globally over the next few decades. And fourthly, and this is an issue that I think receives far too little attention so far here in the United States, we need to have a very robust and coherent strategy for helping the world adapt to inevitable climate change. We often talk about the mitigation side as though that's the solution, and certainly unless you stop polluting, you're going to have a continuing problem that will get worse. But just the climate change that is already locked in is going to create very significant impacts, particularly for the poorest of the poor in the developing world, where they have the least capacity to respond, where they have had the trivial contribution to the climate change that has occurred thus far. General Zinni, Anthony Zinni, former top military brass here, together with a blue ribbon panel of full-chested metal compatriots, concluded that climate change is one of the world's largest threat multipliers, that we are likely to see greater insecurity as a result of climate change, and so that in addition to the humanitarian concerns that we have about the poorest of the poor, we also have a self-interested need in order to be able to work to ensure that they have greater resilience to inevitable climate change and the adverse impacts that they will experience. So those, I think, are the kind of the basic pillars of a climate change foreign policy, but they don't really answer the question, well, how do you do that, and what would the strategies be in each of those areas? And so that really gets me to the second point. How ready are we as a country to really carry forward a climate change foreign policy that would touch on all of those areas? And I think the answer is we're not ready at all. We do not have a bipartisan vision of how the United States is going to lead on this issue and how we're going to engage the rest of the world. The kind of non-debate that we had in the Senate a couple of weeks ago was really just about the domestic emission reduction, and very little. There was a lot of discussion of China, as in they're not doing enough, but not really how are we going to engage China? How are we going to lead? What is our responsibility and our contribution to assisting the international community move in the right direction? So while if you think of it as a learning curve, we've started to climb the learning curve among our political folk on the question of design of a domestic emission reduction regime, but we are very low down on the learning curve in terms of the design of an international policy framework. And that's a real problem. This, of course, is not I'm not making a partisan point. This is not Democrats or Republicans. And in fact, I think you could argue that we've had 20 years of uncoordinated policy. You have the yin and the yang from the Clinton to the Bush administration, or from Bush to Clinton to Bush again, where the president and the Congress were never really on the same page. And we really need to break that pattern of behavior and establish a durable climate change foreign policy around which there's a significant amount of consensus. Even when the Congress has spoken, such as in the 1997 Byrd-Hagel resolution, it was really more of an admonishment to the president about what not to do. Whatever you do, Mr. President, don't bring back a treaty that looks like this. Well, that's not the same thing as saying, here's exactly what the treaty needs to look like. And I applaud the amendment to the Lieberman-Warner-Boxer bill that Senators Biden and Lugar, the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, introduced a couple of weeks ago. But even that amendment just calls on the U.S. to negotiate an international agreement with legally binding commitments by all major emitters. It doesn't actually say what those commitments ought to look like and how we would go about securing those commitments from countries who, like India and China, may not be prepared to offer them currently based on existing U.S. policies. So we've got a long way to go in terms of establishing a clear and coherent vision and a set of deep strategies for a climate change foreign policy. And I think that there are real risks that are incurrent with this kind of state of affairs. Three to come to mind. The first is we may fail to get a good agreement. And scientists tell us that we have probably one last clear chance to avoid catastrophic, unacceptable risks of catastrophic climate change. And so if we don't get a good international agreement and engage in other ways with countries, we, I think, stand a good chance of blowing this last good opportunity. If we are not clear about what we want, how can other countries make the concessions that we need in order to be able to get what we want, in order to be able to participate in those agreements? Secondly, I think the lack of consensus within the political parties really creates the likelihood that the next president, regardless of whether that's John McCain or Barack Obama, will have a climate change foreign policy that the other party will demonize, because there's just too much of an opportunity to define politically the party that's not in the White House, to define its approach in opposition to the new president's approach. Whereas if we had, as we did in the Cold War with containment, or as we have in our support for Israel in the Middle East, some kind of fundamental building blocks or pillars about what our foreign policy would be, there would be much more constancy from one administration to the next. And that lack of consensus creates the opportunity for, I think, political mischief and political division. The third real risk is that and this is really the topic of the panel, which I want to focus on the most here, is that we will fail to use the opportunity that our domestic law provides to unilaterally create mechanisms and tools to engage other countries and to lay the groundwork for an international agreement that the U.S. ought to and could join. And that's would be a horrible outcome, I think, if we are unable to close this gap and to define a vision and to use the opportunity that a domestic cap and trade bill provides in order to engage other countries. So that's my sense of where we are. The kind of the third housekeeping item before turning to the substance of the question was just to give you my sense of a status report on where the international negotiations stand. And there, I think that there have always been two negotiations going on simultaneously within the climate processes. There's a negotiation among developed countries, and there's a negotiation between developed and developing countries. And the quick report I would give you is that the negotiation among developed countries is actually moving forward quite nicely, with the exception of the total level of effort. But the structural elements for the new agreement have really come together. Think back to this time last year, just before the G8 summit that occurred in Heiligendamm, Germany, and think about the Bush administration's policy position on international climate negotiations. The president's policy at that time was we don't need a new agreement. If we do negotiate an agreement, it shouldn't be within the UN. The U.S. should not make any legally binding commitments. There shouldn't probably be any commitments, but certainly not legally binding. And we don't agree with the IPCC and the European-backed goal of reducing global emissions by 50% by the year 2050. And if you look at those elements and kind of break them down like that, see where the Bush administration is now, it's really, I think, night and day, quite a very different position. Last year at the G8 summit, the president said the UN is the right forum. We should negotiate a new agreement. The U.S. is prepared to make commitments. We don't think we should have a national target, and we don't think that all of the commitments should be legally binding. And on that 2015 goal, I'll think about it. And but nevertheless, quite a lot of progress. That position stuck through the Bali Agreement, and that's why at the last global conference we were able to secure an international consensus that there ought to be a new negotiation, that countries should consider commitments. But it wasn't clear whether the 2050 goal of 50% emission reductions was going to be a global goal, because the Bush administration was still thinking about it. And also, it was not clear whether all major emitters would have legally binding commitments, and whether those commitments would be reflected as national targets. In the Rose Garden in April of this year, President Bush said the U.S. is prepared to have a national target. We're going to grow our emissions until 2025, but nevertheless, it's a national target of capping emissions and beginning to reduce them as of that point. And secondly, we would be prepared to make that commitment legally binding if China, India, and other major emitters were also prepared to make legally binding. And then just in the last couple of weeks, we've heard that in preparation for this year's G8 summit, that the environment ministers of the G8 countries have signaled that it's highly likely that either the G8 leaders or at a meeting of the major emitters, the 17 largest emitting countries that will occur the day after the G8 summit, that there will be consensus around this 2050 goal that Europe proposed a year ago, that the internationally agreed upon goal by the major emitters will be to reduce emissions 50% by mid-century. So that's a pretty significant shift in U.S. policy, and not that dissimilar from what I think either a McCain or a Bush or a Obama administration would be pursuing. What is left unresolved is what the U.S. goal will be, and what the nature of the contribution or commitments will be from developing countries, and what other incentives, carrots and sticks, will need to be in play in order to make the whole deal happen. And that's very significant. So I don't want to sugarcoat and make it sound like the negotiations are all set and we're done. We're not, but there's nevertheless been very significant movement. So that's the international context. We have lack of preparedness and readiness here in this country, and really only the outlines of what a policy would be rather than a well-developed strategy. So what do we do about that? And I guess I'd like to offer two kind of different sets of recommendations. The first is procedural, and the second set are substantive. So let me start with the procedural recommendations. My recommendation, and this is reflected in the RFF discussion paper, which is available online, is that we need to fundamentally change the way the United States goes about negotiating international climate agreements. And I said earlier, and trying to be a little provocative, we should stop negotiating international climate treaties. And I mean that, but I don't mean we should stop negotiating international climate agreements. What's the difference between an agreement and a treaty? Okay, here's where it gets technical and legal, and I draw on my experience as a former State Department lawyer. A treaty is a kind of agreement, but it's not the only agreement. An agreement is a document that codifies a commitment by one country to another country that is legally binding under international law. Well, there are other kinds of agreements besides treaties, and a treaty is a magic word in the United States because it's mentioned explicitly in the Constitution. Treaties in our system of government require the advice and consent by 2/3 of the Senate in order for the U.S. to become a party to a treaty. In fact, the vast majority of international agreements that the United States enters into are not treaties. They're a variety of different kinds of executive agreements. And executive agreements, of which there are several different kinds, do not require that 2/3 approach. And let me highlight one specific kind of executive agreement that I think would have a lot of benefits if we were to use it as a model. And it's called a congressional executive agreement. This is an agreement that the president negotiates but submits to both houses of the Congress for approval by a simple majority vote, and the cloture rules for filibuster are in play in the Senate, so you ultimately need 60 in the Senate. But it's both houses of Congress, and I would argue that this approach, which we use in hundreds of different areas, and in fact 85% of the international agreements that the U.S. enters into in any given year, roughly about 300 of these international agreements are done as congressional executive agreements. Only 6% are done as treaties. So why does this approach make sense for climate change? And really, I think that there are several reasons. The first is we're going to get a better deal. The second is that we're going to be able to participate, and that's not clear that we would be able to do that following the treaty model. Let me highlight how this might work, because there are many variations on it, by turning to one prominent area of international cooperation where we do use congressional executive agreements, and that's the context of international trade. The NAFTA agreement, the World Trade Agreement, these are congressional executive agreements. So proving the point that it is not the case that all the really important ones are treaties and lesser ones are somehow something else. We have used the congressional executive form in many different instances that are incredibly important. In fact, Hawaii became a state in the United States through a congressional executive agreement. So really over, as I said, 100 different areas. The way that it works in trade, at least in the modern process, it used to be called Fast Track, is now called Trade Promotion Authority, and it has 5 distinct elements, and let me just highlight them. Firstly, the Congress, by enacting a statute, which has to go through all of the requirements of any other statute, establishes the President's negotiating authority to negotiate international agreements. Second, it defines by statute the U.S. negotiating objectives. These are obviously a negotiation between the executive branch and the legislative branch, because the President has to sign the statute in order for it to come into law unless the Congress overrides a veto. But so there's a joint effort to establish the negotiating objectives of the United States. Thirdly, these statutes create mechanisms to improve coordination between the Congress and the executive branch, such as the creation of formal observer delegations in the Congress or mandatory reporting requirements by the President to ensure that the Congress and the President are on the same page throughout the negotiating process. Fourthly, the statute establishes that the agreements that come back will be handled as congressional executive agreements rather than as treaties. And I should highlight that our courts have said that the President and the Congress have the authority to decide at their discretion whether an international agreement should be considered to be a treaty or considered to be a congressional executive agreement under U.S. law. And both the NAFTA and the WTO, for example, were challenged in court, and in one case the Supreme Court upheld the classification of the NAFTA as a congressional executive agreement, even upheld the fast-track provisions, the kind of expedited approval process, which is the last point I'd like to make. The fifth distinguishing feature of these congressional executive agreements in the trade practice is that the agreements, when they come back to the Congress, get reviewed in a expedited manner. Specifically, looking at the last Trade Promotion Authority bill, which expired last year, the Congress has a responsibility to vote, straight up or down vote, with no amendment, no filibuster, no holds, within 90 legislative days. Now, why did that make sense in trade? Every president in the last 30 years has said that they had to have Trade Promotion Authority in order to be able to succeed in liberalizing trade. Why? Well, because it works, because by creating a clear path to U.S. participation, by defining by statute what the United States needs in order to participate. We enhance the credibility and effectiveness of our negotiating team. We create incentives for our negotiating partners to make concessions that are politically difficult for them to make, because they know that they won't be making them for naught, that if they make those concessions, there's a very high likelihood that the U.S. will become a party to the agreement. The United States, while trade is controversial in this country, and we can look to the Pennsylvania and Ohio primaries for evidence of that, nevertheless, the U.S. becomes a party to almost all of the trade agreements that it negotiates. And that's because whether the agreements are good or not is not my point, but rather that the Congress concludes that the President faithfully met the negotiating objectives that the Congress established, and therefore the Congress gives its consent to those agreements. And that same mechanism would work in climate change. So I advocate the creation of Climate Protection Authority, or if you will, Climate Protection and Climate and Competitiveness Protection Authority, where the Congress would follow the same process as we now use for trade agreements, enacting by statute in the context, at the simultaneous to enacting a domestic cap-and-trade bill. We would create this authority, authorize the President to go negotiate these agreements, establish what the objectives are, and create a path to U.S. participation. Let me just give you a quick and conclude with a quick political analysis of why this approach might make sense and how it might work in practice. The European Union has said that it will do 20% below 1990 emission mitigation if other countries don't join it in an ambitious new international climate agreement. But as part of a new climate agreement, it would achieve a 30% emissions reduction. The U.S. could take that same approach and say, here's a first step. This is what the U.S. is prepared to do unilaterally because of our place in the world, because it's the right thing to do, because of our emission levels. However, we would be prepared to make the newly enacted cap level more stringent if certain conditions were met. And it would be up to the President to go negotiate an agreement that satisfied those conditions. Then the agreement would go back to the Congress, and the Congress would be taking a straight up or down vote on whether the conditions had been satisfied. The number would be negotiated by the Congress in advance, so we wouldn't have 20 and 30% because those numbers are not realistic for the U.S. given our emissions growth, but you'd have X and a Y. The international community would have an incentive to make the concessions because they would know that the level of U.S. mitigation would go from X to Y if they made those concessions. So just a quick political wrap-up. The next president should love this for the same reason that they like it in trade and in other areas. Generally, the executive branch has a preference for congressional executive agreements over treaties, and this would provide enhanced credibility to our negotiating team. The House of Representatives should find this approach attractive, I would argue. The House plays absolutely no role under the Constitution for the review of an agreement, although they do get involved in the enactment of a treaty, but they do get involved in the enactment of implementing legislation. Here, however, as they are in trade agreements, they're involved on equal footing with the Senate from the start. The Senate, of course, might have some questions and concerns about whether it should give up its treaty prerogative. They've already done so in 85% of the cases, and the question really has to be asked, why do we hold the line here on climate change? And it has many characteristics of trade agreements. It's economically significant. There are many, many countries. The agreements are incredibly hard to conclude, even more difficult to renegotiate. Those are all the reasons why we tend to follow this approach in other areas and why it makes sense for the Senate to acquiesce here. Industry would find that there would be greater predictability. They would understand how an international agreement is going to interact with a domestic law, because the level of emissions reductions would be agreed in advance. The contribution from China and others would be negotiated in advance, and there'd be less uncertainty about how an agreement that is concluded at the international level after the enactment of a domestic cap and trade would affect that cap and trade. And I think many are rightfully concerned about locking in a deal that they think is going to last for a generation when, in fact, it might be renegotiated in a couple of years because of international pressure. And finally, the environmental community should like this agreement because it provides a clear path to U.S. participation, which I think they rightly see as a precondition for really engaging the world and having a robust mitigation regime. So time doesn't permit me to get into the specifics of what a policy would look like in terms of technology transfer and a number of other areas. I hope that I'll get some questions on that in the Q&A. I would just leave you on that front with some figures. The cost of adaptation is estimated to be $86 billion annually. The cost of making sure that rapidly emerging developing countries grow in a manner that's consistent with the climate change emission reduction scenarios, stabilization scenarios that you saw this morning. That cost is estimated to be between $20 and $40 billion annually. The cost of ramping up government-sponsored R&D just in the United States alone to put it on par with the level of effort that we achieve in many other areas, whether it's the War on Terror or it's the Strategic Defense Initiative from the Reagan era, or whether it was the Carter era clean energy program, that in today's dollars would be a $10 to $15 billion increase in U.S. funding alone. So we've got billions and billions that would need to be mobilized in order to provide incentives to developing countries to create the framework for international cooperation. And when one looks at the political reaction to the Lieberman-Warner bill, a lot of it was of the opposition was centered around the perceived dramatic increase in the scale of government. And so the kind of the conundrum that I would leave you with is that in order to be able to have something to offer internationally and to be a partner internationally, we're going to need new government spending either directly or through appropriations or spending that we channel through a market such as a cap and trade program. And yet a lot of the political opposition that we're seeing now to cap and trade is built around the cost of the program, the net cost, and the net increase in government spending. And so we've seen amendments to introduced to recycle the revenue, to return it to consumers. I think these things, this is a little bit of a tug of war that is going to have to be played out between the domestic expedience of returning the money to the consumer and the international necessity of being able to come into it in negotiation with some carrots to be able to offer other governments.
I can't even change that. Well, this changes things, but it doesn't point. Okay, never mind. First, as with all the other speakers, I'm so delighted to be here. Okay, I'll stand much closer to the mic. I am really delighted to be here. A few years ago, I had the incredible good fortune to spend a year at Resources for the Future, and it was a wonderful experience. And I always enjoy coming back as it gives me the opportunity to catch up on the papers that the researchers here have written, which always turn out to be extremely relevant to an awful lot of work that I do. So I'm really pleased to be here. In this particular case, it turned out to be kind of frighteningly relevant because I was asked to speak, I hope, at least I understood that I was asked to speak, about innovation policy and how this related to climate change. And there's been a great deal of research done by the people here at Resources for the Future, and I'm actually going to be touching on some of that. So I called my talk Optimal Climate Change and Optimal Innovation Policy at Odds. After listening to Howard this morning, I wish I had called it Design, Choice, and Abatement Supply Potential. I don't think I'm quite there yet, but I'm hoping to get there. This is fairly preliminary, and I welcome comments and criticisms. Okay, so what I'm going to do, let me go back for a minute. Where I'm going with this is that I'm going to talk a little about sort of fundamentals of what we know about the innovation process. And then I'm going to argue that in trying to formulate a climate change policy, the basic strategies that have been used tend to emphasize static efficiency over dynamic efficiency. And this is a problem. In innovation, you usually can't get a first best. We're always trying to balance different considerations. And the same thing, I think, has happened here. And basically the direction that I'm going, and I will get there certainly within 20 minutes, especially if you keep me, I don't have a watch, is that I hope that some of these issues can be taken into account in the models that we heard about this morning, because I think that they mischaracterize what they call first best and second best. And I'm going to try to argue that maybe we should switch those. So, as I said, first I'm going to talk a little about these fundamental issues in innovation policy that I think are very familiar, but they have some consequences for greenhouse gas emission policy that maybe haven't been integrated into the way that we've thought about formulating policies. Okay. Here are my curves. These curves probably look familiar. The first one tends to be, if you have a successful innovation, what we tend to see is the cost of it falls over time. And this is sometimes called a learning curve. Sometimes it just has to do with scale economies. I want to talk a bit about what's actually behind that. And then the other thing that you see here is the so-called diffusion curve. And what we again see in successful innovations is that there's usually rather slow uptake. This is without government policy, obviously. And then it steeply, the penetration rate, if you will, goes up rather steeply and then levels off when everybody's bought it. So that's these curves are pretty standard. Where are they coming from? Well, here's what we know, and this is empirical regularities, but it's really very, very regular. Okay, there tend to be very large fixed costs associated with innovations, particularly important innovations. One of the implications of that is that as you sell more, you're spreading those costs over more units. So, of course, the cost declines per unit. But sometimes the fixed costs are very, very large to begin with. Okay, so keep that in mind. Second, after you've invented something, there's a lot of innovation that happens after that. Indeed, some economists argue that the major gains, Alec and Mowry have written about that. Really the major gains that happen in innovation is not with this original bright idea, but with all of these very small incremental innovations that lead up to deployment. What you get through these, and here's where the learning comes in, and there's really three pieces to it. Learning by doing, which is economies of production. So you learn how to make it better and you learn cheaper ways of doing it for production. There's the so-called learning by using, and this is when people are actually using the technology, they think of better, more effective ways to use it. This presumably feeds back into production, and there's complementarities there. And the third is what often happens, what would happen with an important new technological innovation, is that, and it's sort of part of learning by using, but I've put it separately, the development of complementary technologies that make the innovation much more valuable. So what one has over time, and the first little diagram I have up here shows average cost just sort of going back because we're thinking of better and better ways to do it. So it's the whole curve is shifting back. At the same time, we tend to see demand shifting out, okay, because the product is not static, okay. We're not talking about just doing the same thing cheaper. We keep doing, with a new innovation, we keep thinking of better ways to do it, and ways, therefore, that give you a product that's more valuable, or better ways to use it with. So this is the idea of complementary technologies. So what you see is the demand curve shifting out. And when you put the two of those together, this is where you get what looks like this very sharply declining learning curve, because we're selling more and we're doing it cheaper. But and here's sort of the key that comes in. When does the private sector thrive? When will this happen? And the first point is pretty obvious: when you have a lot of money, okay? And it's not so much, and this is a point that's sometimes made in climate change, that we're worried that we won't be able to charge a price equal to long-run marginal cost. The real problem with major innovations is we need a lot more money than that, okay? We sort of need some large share, perhaps, of the surplus that might be associated with it, which is the second little diagram that I have here. Okay? So this is what we want to get at, that those fixed initial costs and the high expense of the initial units of any new technology that we might be selling are going to be very expensive. And typically what happens when you have major innovations is the innovator is going to be in a position to charge monopoly prices, but more importantly than that, to price discriminate. So it's sort of price discrimination is making this world go around. And if you can't do that, there's a good chance you're not going to be able to raise enough money to pay the fixed costs, especially given the sort of risks associated with innovation that you need to actually get. So this is you sort of see where I'm going here. I'm going to argue that we're going to have to price discriminate in order to get good stuff coming out of this business. And we're going to have to price discriminate probably at any given time across consumers, so that what you really want to be doing is some kind of Ramsey pricing. It may be that rich people are paying more than poor people. It may be some other formulation here such that people who have very high demand, high value for the product, somehow are getting charged more than the other people. So that's one. The second is across time. And here, I've argued this with some of my colleagues, and there's an issue. You could say, okay, we think this technology is going to get cheaper over time. So what I'm basically saying is, you can't. True Toyota did it. Okay, they figured the Prius is going to get cheaper, more people are going to buy it, we'll get experience, and so on. We can have a loss leader and sell them probably, from what I understand, they were selling them for some number of years below cost, the price was below cost. They weren't making any money on them, and now maybe they're breaking even. But in general, what you see with new technologies is you charge more at the beginning and you charge less later on. Okay, and I would argue that it's very difficult to try to finance the later profits, to cross-subsidize across time. And partly it's because of a point that I don't have up here. I think it might be on my next slide. Let's see if I can get there. No. Let me go back to the pictures then. Partly this is because there's so much uncertainty involved in innovation. So this is sort of another key feature, that you don't know who actually is going to be the person selling the good later on when it gets to be cheap enough. Now, in fact, it did turn out to be Toyota. They're still selling their hybrid, now. And they're still in control of the technology, and they're still the leader there. But what's much more common, particularly in more competitive industries, is it'll actually be a different firm. So if you start out with your innovation and you're the loss leader, by the time the costs get down because you've gotten down the learning curve, it might be somebody else selling it. As a result, it's actually very difficult to do that cross-subsidization across time. It's difficult to, for example, finance it, to borrow money from a bank and saying, finance my losses today because in 5 years I'm going to make a lot of money on this invention. And instead what you see is, in fact, the price actually does go down. Okay, so this is this argument that what we really, if you want to be successful, if you want to have a very pro-innovative policy, then if it's going to be done by the private sector, price discrimination is going to have a large role to play in what's going on. Okay. A couple of other points, and I'll go through these kind of rapidly. The industries that are dynamic, have a lot of innovation, they tend to be competitive. There's a lot of evidence, for example, that when industries were deregulated, they had this huge surge in innovation and particularly deployment of new technologies. Even when this is sort of going on at the public level, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, where you have a lot of different agencies involved is another mark of a public set of policies that tend to be more successful. Although there's an argument here that it's not. It could be because the public bureaucracies are competing with each other. It also could just be because it's a really interesting idea, so everybody's trying to get a piece of the action. So I'm not going to push that one too much. But certainly competition in the private sector is strongly associated with innovation. Notwithstanding that, so I've argued on the one hand we have to sort of have a monopolistic situation, on the other that you want some competition. This is, as I was saying, there's conflicts that come up when you want to innovate. And the balance that works well and has worked very well in the United States is, whether it's through the patent system or not through the patent system, having an industry which, while it's competitive over time, at any given point in time may be much less than perfectly competitive. So we have leaders that can exercise the extent of monopoly power that you might need for this kind of pricing strategy that I'm talking about at a given point in time, but can't do it for very long. And that's kind of the nature of the way a lot of the innovation the system of innovation works in the United States. So it doesn't conflict as much as one would think, okay? The idea of being able to have some monopoly power at any given point in time and nevertheless having a competitive structure to the industry over time. So this is sort of what I'm arguing, is you want to be able to price discriminate. You also, in order to do that, you want to be able to differentiate among your consumers. You want to have early adopters who will pay more. These are all pieces of what typically would go into a successful innovation strategy. Okay, so that was mostly private side. Now let's talk for a moment about the government side of things. And there's very large literature here as well this is sort of 30 years worth of analyses of attempts by the public sector to promote innovation. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of aspects of that I think are particularly relevant for climate change in the limited time that we have here. More successful government programs. Well, first of all, in the United States, the kinds of institutions that we have for supporting research are considered to be very successful. Academics publish a lot of papers. This is sort of where it comes down. But this is one of the pieces of that seems to be something that the government has figured out between the various different organizations that contribute to research in the United States. We've had a lot of success. Programs directed at government missions, that is, innovation connected with things like the space program and the defense program. There's been a lot of successes in those areas. Where programs have been oriented towards industry and commercial technology, which in part is more what we're talking about, I'm going to have to qualify this a little bit more, but again, there's been some very successful programs. And it appears that the programs that tend to work rather better, if you're really dealing with commercial technology, is when the public and private sectors work together quite closely. So the sort of cost-shared industry, government, public-private joint ventures have had some notable successes, and even these kinds of collaborations with various kinds of consortia. There was a study done, it's now about 5 years ago, that the National Research Council did for the Department of Energy that Bob Fry chaired. And one of the major conclusions that came out of that was when they chose a program that actually addressed some kind of market failure, those were the programs where they tended to be more successful. Now, this isn't very surprising because there isn't. If it was something where there isn't a market failure, there's no reason why the public sector should really be doing it in the first place. And it would be typically that set of programs where what was left, as it were, for the government agency to do wasn't necessarily the best idea. Okay, that is, private industry, if they see money to be made, usually aren't really interested in sharing it with a whole bunch of other people and in collaboration with the federal government and so on. So if there's seriously some kind of market failure and actual public good, that's good news for the government trying to get involved. And those also turned out to be the types of programs where industry were happy to work in consortia and to work together with the government. So the 3 points that I have here actually mutually reinforce each other. More money. This may seem like a pretty stupid point, but more money helps. Okay, but specifically more money helps because there's real returns to scale, as it turns out. And this gets back to what I was talking about earlier. If you have enough money that you can do 4 different projects, you have a vastly higher probability of success. And it gets back to this notion that you don't know who it is that's going to come up with a good idea, and that competition among people who are working on these projects is extremely valuable when you're dealing in innovation. and where the government could de-emphasize economic profits specifically. And this is, again, this may seem pretty obvious, but given that we see that the government tends to be successful when you're actually dealing with the public good, it's not surprising that there's not a lot of money to be made after you finally invent the product. And what we found in our analysis of Department of Energy projects was that there were many that were extremely successful in actually reducing pollution in various ways, even some of the fossil fuel programs. But usually they didn't make any money, so there was a lot of complaints about them from people who wanted to evaluate them in terms of how much money did they make, and they weren't making any money. That was why the government was involved in them in the first place. So if the political sector is such that they're willing to go with that and recognize that there's a public good here and you're not going to make any money on it, then the programs tended to have longer-term support, which got us out of one of the classic problems that you run into, which Nigel just mentioned, the yin-yang business, that you're up and you're down in a lot of these projects. And most R&D is actually a long-term investment, and that undermines them entirely. So these are the sort of conditions that held in the programs that were working better. And I wanted to briefly mention 3 specific energy programs, which many of you may be familiar with. So I'll just say a word or two about them. And it's because they come from very different areas, okay? Photovoltaics was the research project that was done in the 70s and early 80s in photovoltaics. It was largely through NASA. It was very successful in bringing down the cost. And what most of this was aimed at was an interesting kind of competition that NASA set up among producers. So there was kind of an auction that went on, and they kept re-auctioning it. So that worked out very well. Wind power costs have come down dramatically in the public programs that have supported wind technology. And here we're talking about really cost reductions from straight subsidization of users. So it's a very different strategy. But again, there were a lot of people involved on the user side. And there was not much in the way of money that was to be made in either of these endeavors. Gas turbines is an interesting project because the program specific program I'm thinking of was largely a spillover from work that was done on airplanes. So it's sort of 3 very different models, all of which in fact led to some successful technology effort by the government. So there's many different ways one can do it. And I was trying to just identify some of the sort of key features that seem to come about. Okay, climate change policy. So where most of the analysts tend to agree is, first of all, they said the pricing of emissions is crucial, but it's not adequate. It's crucial. Okay, I better move on. Crucial because we're not going to get the extent of evolutionary improvements through directed government programs. That's the sort of thing the government really isn't any good at. There's too many different issues involved. There's too many different people who might have a good idea. And we don't want them to all have to just deal with some government program, whether it be a prize, a subsidy, or whatever. One wants to do that through some kind of price mechanism. Given that, I say inadequate because it's thought that the price is not going to be high enough. And you saw my little diagram. We need a lot of money here. And it's very unlikely that the price that would ever be charged for your carbon permit would be high enough to support the kind of research that we're talking about. Subsidies. Okay, this is government giving money to people. Crucial but inadequate. That's the reverse side of it. I already did the other half. You need prices too. There's general agreement on both of those issues. Less agreement on how to achieve policy stability. I'm going to mention a couple of these. We'll come back later if people are interested. About whether one should be using direct expenditures or tax expenditures. There's a lot of trouble, it turns out, with tax expenditures. There's a lot of trouble with direct expenditures. I'm going to skip that as well. What I want to do is move on to cap and trade specifically. As I broadcast at the beginning, what I'm concerned about is that this so-called idealized scenario, which we talked about, which we heard about at length this morning, may actually retard innovation. That if you're talking about some perfect global trading scheme, and I admit, this is the cartoon version, but I think the point is here, with offsets, credit, banking, and borrowing, how are we going to price discriminate? Okay? Especially if you can borrow. What you're basically talking about, and this is my drug analogy here, is you want to set up a system where not only can you re-import drugs from Canada, Brazil, and India, but you can actually delay your illness until the generic drug becomes available. And that's not the way innovation works. So if you'll buy into that, and I'm happy to discuss this, then what I would suggest is that as part of this policy, we should embrace price discrimination and product differentiation. And the idea of gradual accession, we want to identify the early adopters because that's going to be a critical part of trying to promote innovation. Now, I recommend California, since they actually want to do it, they're crazy, let them go ahead. You know, they can be the early adopter for this stuff. The Europeans, it's fine, okay? And I tried to think of a couple of other ideas. Like I said, this is pretty new, but I think what we have to think about are policies that are going to go with this idea of trying to set up markets and yet allow for imperfect competition. So that means that there's going to be differences in how we want to treat different actors, maybe, and differences in how we actually want to set this thing up. Because actually going for something that looks more like perfect competition is unlikely to raise the kind of money that we want in order to promote this sort of learning, which can't be rushed that much. Okay? The business of trying to get back and forth from the users to the producers and think of better ways of doing it and complementary technologies, you can't sort of shove it all into a single amount of time. And if that's the case, then some different considerations, I would hope, would enter some of these models. Thank you.
Linda, I'll just ask a quick question. So if I interpret what you're saying correctly, if there were a really high price in the industrialized countries and a very low price in the developing countries, the industrialized countries are acting like your first purchasers of Prius who are willing to pay a lot more for their reduction in order to finance the investments in technology that would be lower and then eventually...
There's two pieces to it.
Yeah.
One is that somebody has
to...
I'm sorry. Two pieces to it. One is somebody has to pay for this. Okay? So at a given point in time, we might be talking about a cross-subsidy. Or it might not even be a cross-subsidy, but it's different prices. So it's the same idea as the drug is high in the U.S. and it's low in Africa. And it means that everybody gets it. And if we could only charge a single price, it would be too high for the Africans, even though it might be somewhat lower in the U.S. So this is just, at a given point in time, we have a higher efficiency if we can price discriminate. Okay, so that's sort of point one. The second is we want an early adopter so that we can move down that learning curve. And not everybody will be able to afford it at the beginning. And putting that up as a constraint might mean that we don't get the technology at all if we can't somehow price discriminate. So what I'm concerned about is that if you have a cap-and-trade system, and let's suppose, think in terms of the drug, right? That instead of installing this technology in the U.S. where you have to pay a high royalty fee to the inventor, you can do it in Indonesia where you don't. Then the inventor can't charge two prices in the two different places. So the global trading scheme undermines our attempts to geographically discriminate, right?
Just one more. The feedback between invention and prices in a cap-and-trade program, how do those interact with the drivers for innovation, and how does that compare then to the price certainty that you would have with the carbon tax program?
Maybe this is a question for later.
Okay.
I have to think about it for a start so I can shut it off.
Well, thanks very much. I sort of feel like the old line from the Monty Python, now for something completely different. In terms of this is a panel that has a very broad mandate to it, so we could spend a lot of time, and it would be good to explore some of these other objectives that ought to be going along with climate policy, or about technology innovation. Linda's done a really good job about that. I decided to sort of pick on one specific area and talk in a little more depth about it, even though it's not as technically satisfying to talk about, perhaps, as some of these others. And that's sort of what are kind of the political challenges that face Congress and the President in trying to craft some kind of and enact. You can craft legislation. We get lots of bills introduced all the time. The tough thing is actually enacting them. And how do we do that? I can give you, obviously, there are a million stories up on the Hill about how this might happen. I can only give you my perspective, and I won't posit that it's the universal congressional perspective or necessarily even the perspective of everybody on my committee, or I'm not sure that everything I'm about to say even my boss would agree with. But I figured I'd at least give you at least one view of from that I've had. So let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. One of the things I think is true about a lot of legislation is that at the end of the day, the general public tends to be ahead of Congress. And so if we're thinking about the dynamics of enacting legislation on any topic, it's worth examining what's going on with the general public and what are they picking up and what are they transmitting to their elected representatives. Congress can be an awfully conservative place from the small c conservative place in terms of risk avoidance. And so I think that's why it's interesting to sort of think about it. And I think that there are sort of two things generally that the American public at large needs to get, if you will, about climate change in order for us to get a bill through Congress. The first one is they're well on the way, and it's to get really how enormous the scale and the complexity and the urgency of the climate situation is. We have the media to thank for some of this, and we have the scientific community and satellites to thank for some of this, because you see sort of pictures like this. These are enormously helpful pictures, because my mom can look at them and says, wow, that's a big change. And that's my mom's lived a long time, and so 1979 is just yesterday to her. And so, she looks at that and says, and it's just yesterday to me too, actually. And she looks at that and says, wow, I can see a real change there. There's a real problem here. And I think one of the things that has changed the willingness of legislatures all over the world to deal with this issue has been sort of the steady drip, 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 if you don't mind the pun, of stories in the media about melting ice caps and swimming polar bears and the whole 9 yards. And so pictures like that are really worth more than thousands of words. Obviously, one of the things that little less intuitive to people, but I think people are catching up on, is that there are enormous impacts right around the corner. I mean, it's not just the poles, it's all areas of the globe. And here's a nice graphic that shows the potential sea level rise on Bangladesh, as someone pointed out, a country that really has had very little to contribute to the problem. But we're talking about them losing about 16 or 17% of their land area, and millions of people having to be relocated in a not very pretty way, I guess. So people are sort of getting that. And I think that the scientific community, while there is still some good debate going along about whether the number of hurricanes are going to grow or decrease, the scientific community is kind of pretty much come to the conclusion that the intensity of hurricanes is certainly changing, and intensity of storms is changing, and certainly people see that, and when they see stories like the Midwestern floods or they see stories about drought, they begin to get a sense that all this seems to be somehow connected, and that there actually really is a problem of incredible scale going on here that we need to address. The National Academy of Sciences and others are saying, but wait, there's more. It could be even a lot worse than you think, because we're not looking at linear systems here. And just as if I sort of keep moving this across in a nice sort of linear way, at some point it becomes very nonlinear. The climate can become nonlinear, and changed ocean circulation, rapid glacier melting, changed patterns of rainfall, of drought, declines in forest health. I mean, last year was probably our worst fire season in the American West, and we're already, I think, ahead of the game in terms of having a really bad, even worse one this year. So people are seeing that there are some real problems, and they're beginning to absorb. I mean, this is a report that came out in 2002, but people are absorbing that there are step changes that are possible in the system, and that could be very unwelcome. So again, to get people to really sort of focus on making the political system take a large step on this, one of the things that's necessary is for people to really have, and society at large, to have a real understanding of the scale and the scope of the problem. So we're on our way on that one. But the other thing that we need to get about climate change that we're much further from being well on our way towards is really the scale and the complexity and the urgency of the response needed. Typically when we try to get people to go along with a change in the political system that is sort of novel to them, the natural political instinct in every system is to minimize it. Is to say, well, it won't be all that bad. You'll be a little bit of this, a little cut here, a little tuck there, and we'll be able to solve the problem. Sadly, for the case of climate change, that just isn't so. And I think ultimately to put together a public policy in a representative democracy that has a Congress that meets every year and have it have some stability over a long period of time, it just doesn't work to sort of, slip something by people and say, look, don't worry, it won't cost a whole lot. Then they discover that actually, wait, this really is a much bigger change than I bargained for. And then they come back and the whole thing gets repealed the next year. And so, and we have gone through that in other areas. We've gone through that in healthcare, where we've made changes to our overall system of medical insurance, and then people suddenly realized their premiums went way up, and that was gone in a jiffy. And we can't stand to have something like that happen on something as important as climate change. And let's just talk about some of the dimensions of the problem that is in front of us. And these are a bunch of figures that I have lifted from a report that's just been published by the International Energy Agency. We're actually having a hearing on it next week. Ray Kopp's going to be one of our witnesses. The author, Neil Hurst from the International Energy Agency in Paris, is in town next week. He's giving a whole bunch of seminars. One may be here. But he's going all around town talking about this. And it's a very useful report because it really does lay out in an admirable level of detail, but only still skimming the surface in many ways, of sort of where we're headed and what we need to change. And so if you look at sort of the projection, the baseline of where we're headed with global energy use, we're sort of doubling it in every sector that you want to look at. We're roughly doubling, or maybe more than doubling, our global energy use. That's sort of the system that we're sort of looking at. And that makes a lot of sense because a lot of the world is catching up to our standard of living, which, on baseline technology, requires quite a lot of energy per capita. If energy is going up, global carbon dioxide emissions are headed up on the baseline pretty dramatically as well. And again, as you look across the sectors, you can see that where we're headed, is not in a very good place in terms of the world climate. And in fact, the other thing this report has are a couple scenarios of how it might have to change. So here you go. So just to define the terms, the ACT map and the blue map. Okay, so the ACT map, in the year 2050, just gets you back to 2005 emissions. Okay, so that's the difference. Just to sort of in 2050, not really to do much different from what we're doing today, just to get the world back to kind of where we are 2 or 3 years ago. That's the delta between where we're headed in 2050 and where we need to be. And the blue map, of course, is what would be required by this general agreed upon goal of a 50% cut in 2050. So that's another factor of a half from the ACT map. So if you sort of look at kind of where we're headed and kind of where we need to wind up, you can see that's a huge change. That is not a trivial, don't worry, we'll nip and tuck here and you'll make money in the process kind of deal. Here's a chart that actually lays out some of the costs, and of course, cost was a huge issue in Congress as we sort of talked about this. Of course, we had the good luck or the bad fortune, only time will tell, to have had our climate discussion on the floor of the Senate, just as people were coming back from a congressional recess where people were screaming about energy costs, particularly in the transportation sector. And so this is a chart that a number of people have done. This is, again, from the IEA report. McKinsey has done sort of a similar analysis. Obviously, there are some interventions where you actually do make money. You do save money on energy efficiency. But, that doesn't get you very far in terms of where you need to be on the map. Actually, I do have something here. Right. That doesn't mean that sort of gets you over to here. Again, this ACT map, if you sort of look at the scale here, okay, so to sort of get us back to where we need to be, just to sort of stay even in 2005, is sort of a constant dollar figure of somewhere between $50 and $100 per ton, according to the IEA. And then, of course, to get to a 50% reduction, there's a huge bound of uncertainty because largely these technologies here are all things that we pretty well understand what they are. We're not sure we can deploy them, but we're pretty sure we know what they are. Here, to get to these kinds of reductions, we've already thrown everything we had at the wall. Okay, so it's all sticking to the wall. Now we're looking for other stuff, and in terms of getting carbon capture and storage to work in the industry as opposed to utility sectors, to put CCS on cement plants is a lot tougher than putting them on power plants. And then, of course, the whole business of trying to have at emissions reductions, deep emission reductions in the transport sector is really very tough. And so that's why the bounds, the costs, and the uncertainties are so high. Obviously, the energy system is the prime culprit here. I mean, just the energy-related carbon dioxide, but even a number of these other we have methane emissions. A piece of this chunk comes out of the energy system, and of course, high global warming potential gases like sulfur hexafluoride are used in the electric electric transmission distribution system, and so the energy system has a couple of pieces of this too. So the energy system is sort of ground zero for a lot of what needs to happen. And again, without getting into all the busyness of what this is, if you just sort of look at the color coding here, you can sort of see, now wait a minute, here's kind of where we are in the baseline. Okay, you can kind of see the colors that are involved, the kinds of technologies. And one of the things that you notice right away is that we have an entirely different color scheme here than we do here. Okay, and that's the message: is that to get to to stay even or to get to deeper reductions. Obviously, some of the things that we do will involve efficiency, so we'll be using less electricity. But the way we generate electricity worldwide is going to be utterly different, and that's a huge challenge both on the technology side and on the deployment side. The energy system isn't the only one. They go through a series of analyses. Again, in the building sector, there's a tremendous need for changes. In the building sector, again, recognizing that there are going to be a hell of a lot more buildings in 2050 than there are today, and still we just want to have them collectively only use a little bit more energy than what we're using today, or have using less energy. So that's a huge. If you sort of think about that, that's a huge transformation. So, and finally, on top of all that, okay, on top of all the difficulty of what we're looking at here, there's not a moment to lose. We do not have the luxury of sitting around and thinking about this for a good long time. Okay, so essentially, we're going to have a revolutionary transformation of the global energy system. At the same time, the world population is surging, okay, and most of the world population is not in the OECD, okay, so that is not good. Obviously, we are continuing to build lots of capital stock all the time. And the capital stock we're putting in place today, a lot of it's going to be around in 2050. And so if we don't get started as soon as possible, the longer we wait, the more stuff we're wasting. That we will, as it is, according to the IEA, to get to 50% reduction in CO2 means that a fair amount of our coal-fired capacity it will have to be mothballed before its useful life is over. Economic cost of that, and then the longer we wait, the worse things will get. So this is a very substantial and challenge to the political system, because what's implicit in all of this then are changes that people are going to notice in their everyday lives. I mean, you cannot get to this sort of thing without major sort of collateral policy changes, and just to give an example of what one of them might be, and I don't want to get myself in political hot water, but look, there's no way of getting the electricity system of this country transformed without ratepayers figuring that out and figuring out some way of raising that capital and building transmission. the amount of transmission that will have to be built to accommodate renewables that are sited in very remote locations from population centers so that we can get low carbon, access low carbon sources that might be remote. That's a lot of transmission. A lot of those decisions are vested at the state level. If you wanted to get something done like this with not a moment to lose, I don't know how you do that. I guess the question is, I will just simply ask it in the form of a question. How could you possibly do that with the bifurcated system of federal and state responsibility for electricity transmission, distribution, use, and pricing? That is a very good question, but that is one of several. I mean, we have third rail, fourth rail, fifth rails on this one. There are a lot of political third rails involved in trying to address this problem at the speed and with the intensity that we have to do it in order to basically get to a 50% reduction. And trust me, there are many people who think a 50% reduction by 2050 is completely inadequate. We need 70 or 80%. So this is a very tough problem. So what are the domestic political challenges? Okay. Certainly one of them is harnessing the White House leadership role. We generally don't pass major legislation in this country with Congress sort of operating on its own, either with a disinterested executive or an executive that is actively interested in doing something else. So obviously, one of the first political challenges we will have in the next administration is to articulate a leadership role for the president. And to harness that role, which is something that's actually much easier said than done if you've been around many White Houses. Federal agency coordination. There are obviously a multiplicity of federal agencies that need to be involved in this. There is a sort of almost magical belief in some people that I encounter around town that, after the election, this will all get real easy because we'll have President Obama or President McCain, take your pick, they'll get all these bright people in the agencies, of which there are lots, right? And they would be a tremendous asset to sort of get the brain cells of several tens of thousands of people in the executive branch who know actually a lot more about this stuff than most people in Congress do. Working on how to sort of design a rational system. However, as someone who spent a number of years in the Department of Energy and sort of observed and was a member of a lot of interagency groups, interagency coordination of the executive branch sometimes works about as well as intercommittee coordination does in Congress. And so, that is not necessarily a panacea, although I think a lot of people on the Hill aren't quite aware of how difficult getting the right kind of federal agency coordination done quickly and effectively is going to be. Congressional committee coordination, of course, not too far behind. I think one of the things that we're seeing in sort of the news reports out of the House of Representatives is over this past couple of days is the emergence of other committees in the House who are sort of putting their hands up and saying, now, wait a minute, next year when we're doing this for real, we want to be involved. And, of course, the same thing is true in the Senate as well. One of the big problems that we will have politically next year is a function of the bills that have been introduced. We've when you put a cap and trade system together with allowances that have lots of value, people very quickly figured out that we're talking about several trillions of dollars here, and there was a vehicle on the Senate floor that allocated those to lots of people, and people were parts of discussions that says, okay, now how much will my state get? How much will my industry get? One of the problems we have is next year all these people are going to remember, what they had this year, and they're going to they're going to use that as kind of their instead of previously where they started off not knowing what they would get, and so anything was kind of better than what they thought about before. Next year they're going to start thinking about, well, now wait a minute, I had 37.28% of the allowances, and now you're telling me I'm only going to get 29.56. Wait a minute, there's a real raw deal going on here. So I think that one of the problems that we're going to face politically, in my view, is if we're going to put this thing together, we have created a whole set of expectations amongst a whole set of actors across society that they're getting money or allowances or something out of this for free, and it is very unlikely that whatever the president and the federal agencies come up with is going to, if they were to transmit to us the perfect proposal, it would be almost impossible for us to have been so prescient this year to guess actually of what everybody's going to be getting out of this. And so that is going to be a real problem too. Understanding and regulating the market forces that we're about to unleash on this problem. I think that as we, we've been trading oil now for a good long time, and oil has a wonderful physicality to it. There, you can have a barrel of oil somewhere, and you can imagine it. You put them on boats and put them in SPRs, and even with oil, as physical as a commodity as that is, we have turned it into a virtual commodity and securitized it in all sorts of different ways. And people are complaining mightily that there are these, shadowy and not well understood, not well characterized speculative forces that are causing the price of oil to be where it is now. Now, just imagine. Now, oil is kind of like ultimately a physical commodity. CO2 allowance isn't really, and so we're inventing a new commodity, sort of literally out of thin air, and we're going to let market forces price it, trade it, decide where it is, and that is a real, and that may be the most effective way of getting at the problem in an economically efficient way. But understanding ahead of time, all the different ways that people can play games with that to the detriment of the general interest is a real problem that people are going to have to spend a lot of time trying to bend their minds around in order to pass a bill, because people are going to wonder, now wait a minute, all these speculators were putting up the price of oil. How do we know they're not going to bid up the price of carbon dioxide to some stratospheric level? And if you don't have a good answer to that question, you're going to have a hard time passing a bill. Finding the effective balance between federal and state action. And I think that sort of comes at a couple different ways. It comes in sort of the operation of the energy system as we have known it for the past 50 years or more is certainly one piece of that puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is going to be very difficult is to figure out how do we reconcile a sort of a national system with these regional and state-specific systems that are cropping up as time goes on. Educating the public on the difficult and necessary choices ahead. I think that's a real problem. Whoops, that was it. Okay, so there's actually many more. I could come up with many more challenges than that. But those. I mean, this is going to be a very difficult enterprise to undertake under the best of circumstances, and we will be in all events, undertaking this discussion in the United States and worldwide on the backdrop of a lot of pain and agony about high energy prices. And I don't think that we are well served by explaining to people that don't worry, putting a price on carbon isn't going to affect your energy bill, because I think most people get enough about how economics work that know that probably can't possibly be true. And so it is going to be a very difficult political environment under the best of circumstances. But it is, at the same time, absolutely necessary that we go ahead and do it. We don't have the luxury of sitting around and waiting for the price of oil to get back to $20 a barrel before we have the problem. Because if we do, the ultimate cost of the problem, as everyone in this room knows, is just going to be magnified many times over what it would otherwise be. So that's sort of my, I hope not too depressing report on what we're up against here. I mean, I do think that, again, I think that the basic, thing we have to keep in mind is that, this is an incredibly important problem, which is incredibly difficult to solve, and it's incredibly important we get started right away. I just think that, I don't want anything that I've said about the difficulty to sort of be interpreted as saying we need to throw up our hands, or that it's going to take a real long time, or we ought to sort of, kick the can down the road. We cannot kick this can down the road. But it is going to be I don't think that if we're going to be successful at this, we will serve ourselves or anybody else well by going in with a naive view of how difficult this will be, even if we have strong White House leadership, a really good interagency process, really good concordat amongst all affected congressional committees, and everybody decides to be altruistic about this. I mean, this is going to be really a very difficult thing to do under the best of circumstances, and we have a lot of human nature we have to cope with in order to get this thing done.
Well, that was quite good. I enjoyed listening to that. So we had three, as promised, very different presentations. We had Nigel talking about the challenges that development of domestic policy poses for the formulation of new foreign policy for the executive branch, which is all pretty important stuff. Linda was talking about the difficulties in crafting these technology research and development and deployment policies, which are shot through all of the proposals, and everyone assumes we will do this with a wave of the wand and all these technologies will come forward, but that may not be as easy as it seems. And then Bob gave us a pretty frank and open view of how difficult it's going to be to negotiate the political roadblocks or hurdles or whatever is necessary to put this all together. So we have a pretty good amount of time here for questions. So if you would wait for a microphone, provide your name and affiliation, and if you can direct your question to any one of the particular participants, that would be good. And as Billy pointed out, questions are better than statements. So I think let's have this person over here first. You right there.
Julie, I'm from the Department of Energy. I found Dr. Cohen, your presentation on price discrimination very interesting. And I was just thinking about gasoline prices, and I personally find high gasoline prices to be great. I see people taking more public transportation, but I also don't have to eat less food and stay in a smaller apartment because of high gasoline prices. So I was wondering if you had ideas about how to price discriminate in something like gasoline prices, rather without having rich people buy bigger cars and poor people buying smaller cars.
Let's just collect a few questions, and we'll come back. We'll get Dick and then this person up here in front.
Yeah, I'm Dick Morgenstern. I actually have a question for Linda and for Bob. For Linda, I guess the question is, you gave an example of price discrimination with, I guess you said the U.S. and maybe Indonesia. I've forgotten what other countries you used, but how the same technology would be priced differently. Okay, and I guess if you could expand on that a little bit, because the one most obvious example, I guess, that occurred to me was in the energy bill maybe a couple of years ago. I guess there's some big payoff for early nuclear plants. I guess you'd kind of find that very attractive. But how you'd apply that in a more commercial transaction, it wasn't totally clear, so if you could help me there. And for Bob, I don't know if you were here this morning when Howard Grunspeck spoke. No. Well, he, like you, gave a very enlightening set of comments that had implications for the political process. But one of his suggestions was to broaden the scope of issues that Congress deals with in climate legislation so as to address not so much the problem of getting legislation through, which I think was the thrust of where you're going, but some of the kind of unintended consequences that might result afterwards to undermine the goals that were originally sought. Mm-hmm. So for the example he gave was if you wanted to achieve, if you wanted to contain costs but also have a broad balance of broad portfolio of technologies that might not be totally consistent. Mm-hmm. And so one kind of, he didn't mention this, I don't want to pin this on him, but one idea might be for Congress to get involved in actually driving the process on siting or driving the process on technologies that might not be attractive to some of the same communities that were pushing the carbon constraints in the first place. Right. But kicking the ball further down the road and making probably more difficult political decisions, which would seem would perhaps sink the boat. Mm-hmm. But I guess if you could perhaps comment on how or whether something like that might be made to work.
Okay. One more question, Dick. Just pass it right up here.
Hi, Alicia Griffey with the Verdeo Group. Question for Bob. Given how much bartering is likely going to be needed in order to get any kind of legislation passed, I'm curious to get your thoughts on which sectors you think are most likely to be covered under a cap-and-trade system.
Okay.
Okay, let me say a couple things about price discrimination. We're supposed to start talking now?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Can I ask Bob a question?
Oh,
finish up with that. Okay. Sorry. Okay. gasoline is really a different issue for a start. I was talking about innovative technology. So once this issue of wanting to discriminate among users is something that, as a technology becomes mature, doesn't become that relevant a concern. So it's really, in effect, what I'm talking about is a transition strategy. But the transition, I think, is really important in this particular case because it's too expensive now to do the kinds of controls we want. And so technology is a major part of the issues that are going on. So it's sort of a different point in terms of the gasoline prices. As far as the early nuclear plants go, that's exactly the kind of thing that it seems to me. I mean, this is where I'm thinking. I was trying to think of something constructive to put in here. You know, what could we go along with it? And if you want to try to maintain as much as possible the efficiency that is in fact associated with widespread trading, okay, then we might want to think about the discrimination coming in through subsidies, although I don't think they'll be big enough. And that's precisely what those early nuclear plant incentives were supposed to be. I would say that it has to go on for much longer, that it might be in any given year. You know, there's a certain number of incentives available for, you know, the first group that grabs them within a given period of time. I can immediately think of problems with that, which is that, you know, people in November are going to wait until January to build whatever they are so they can get in on the next year's quota of subsidized whatever it is we're talking about. But those are the sorts of, that's certainly the type of policy that one might think about.
But the U.S. international.
Okay. Oh, and one more thing on that. One of the tax incentives that was in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, it was a tax expenditure that only allowed for, you know, a certain amount up to $100 million. I think it was for some kind of power plant.
Right.
That's the kind of thing that you could marry to this sort of bill and then shift it around so that the early adopters then, you know, up to a maximum. Tax expenditures as a rule are pretty expensive, but if you limit it at, you know, $1 million or whatever you want for a certain area, that's the kind of thing that would go along with being able to discriminate. The international issue, I wasn't sure how to deal with that. I guess when we talked a bit about having these international permits and how many, someone talked about it at the previous session, that maybe there would only be a certain amount of international permits that you'd be able to purchase. I mean, that's where it seems to me that we have to think about these two issues, whether it's better to try to promote static efficiency by allowing trading across all countries or not. And there might be some intermediate resolution which actually is better, that to some degree limits the extent of international trading. That's where I want the modelers to try to think about this and put in some assumptions about how innovation works.
Okay. Well, let me take a whack at the two questions asked me. If I understand Howard Gruenbeck's question is sort of, so how can we make this even more difficult by adding more contentious issues into the fray? I'm not anxious to wander into my boss's office and says, "Gee, Jeff, I have a great idea for how to do that." You know, I do think though that one of the realities of the legislative process is that people do bring you know, important equities to it, sort of across a wide range of areas. And the nuclear example is, I think, very apt because there are a variety of sort of moderate Republican senators who are very interested in promoting nuclear power, and there was a lot of reportage. You know, we never actually got to any amendments on the bill, but there was a lot of reportage that if we ever did, one of those would be a nuclear amendment that Senators Lieberman was kind of okay with it, Senator Warner, Senator Voinovich. These are the kinds of names that were sort of bandied about as people who wanted to do something on the nuclear side. So you know, in terms of trying to address some of those issues, some of that actually naturally does happen because you do have you do have a collection of 100 people who in the Senate and many in 435 in the House who are working their will on it, and they all do bring you know, different perspectives and desires and policy interests to it. And so in the process of trying to assemble sort of a sufficient coalition to get something passed, you almost necessarily have to pick up some of these ancillary issues to other people, their central issues. But you do get this sort of diversity effect in it, and if you're so obviously there's an opportunity if you can figure out how to do that cleverly enough to do good and to do well at the same time. That would be how you would do it. I have to say that assembling energy politics generally and climate politics is going to be like this in the same way. People always imagine that energy is a great partisan wedge issue, and at sort of the bumper sticker level, maybe it is. But when you get down into the actual nitty-gritty of it all, it gets regional real fast because different regions of the country have entirely different energy profiles and are affected in entirely different ways by energy legislation, and the same will also be true to a great degree of climate legislation. And so, that's always good news, is because if you can keep something out of a wildly partisan atmosphere, your chances of success are much greater. It means, however, you have to then assemble interregional coalitions, which is sort of an interesting task in its own right. The other question was, what sectors that I think would be, first into the pool under a cap-and-trade system. I think that the way I would sort of think about that is I think that different sectors of the economy are at sort of different stages of acceptance of the inevitability of a cap-and-trade system, and different stages of having sorted through amongst themselves how they might want to interact with it. And so obviously the power sector, they've sort of seen this one coming for a while now, and so they have have done a lot of thinking about it. I don't know that it's all completely gelled, but you certainly have some very prominent leaders of the power sector who have decided they needed to get involved in this. And then I would put after that general industry, the building sector, the general industry sector being energy-intensive industries particularly. They sort of see that they've got some real equities at stake here, and they need to be engaged in the process. The building sector, I think a lot of people who are involved in building design see real opportunities here. A lot of people who actually involved in building construction aren't entirely so sure they want to change all their construction practices overnight. And so there's some tension there, but the building sector is a little further behind that. I think the equipment sector certainly sees a greater push on efficiency coming at them. I think the sector that's having the hardest time trying to figure out how they fit into all this is the transportation sector, both on the equipment side, the vehicle side and the fuel side, trying to figure out how the paradigm of a cap-and-trade system really applies or should apply to them. And of course, as you can see from the IA thing, that's some of the hardest problems for deep emission reductions technologically are in the transportation sector. So that's how I would sort of rank order those.
Other questions? We'll take Jake Jacoby, and then one in the back, and then up here in the front. Right behind you.
Jake Jacoby at MIT. This is a question for Nigel. Going back to the discussion of the status of negotiations, would you say more about what's going on between the developed and developing countries, I suppose, in Bali, and your view of how we should think about the interaction between these two venues and the United States' different roles in them?
Jake, guys at the back, the fellow behind you there.
I'm David Tucker with Defenders of Wildlife. My question's for Nigel as well, and possibly Bob. You mentioned earlier the congressional executive agreements, and I was wondering if there is more enforceability with that in terms of having an agreement with another country with carbon reductions, if you have a greater opportunity for enforcement versus with a treaty or some other type of agreement.
Up here in the front somewhere. Right here. Lisa.
Hello, this is Celine from the Alliance to Save Energy. So I guess anyone can answer this question, but there's no perfect proposal for cap and trade. We agree on that. And in terms of allocation of proceeds and allowances, especially, but there's also an agreement that we need R&D funding, and perhaps much more than what's currently being discussed in the current proposals. Lieberman and Warner probably falls short of funding for R&D. And Nigel mentioned the need to increase U.S. funding on R&D by 10 billion to 15 billion. But what's the equation for coming up with those numbers, and how do we know how much and on what to spend the money on, and perhaps through which institution? Is there any widely accepted method of this calculation, or what's the academic literature saying on this? Thanks.
Sure. So I got three questions. The first is talk a little bit about the dynamic in the negotiations between the developed and the developing countries. And in order to understand that, I think I need to spend just a minute on the internal dynamic among developing countries now, because developing countries negotiate as a bloc, but they've never had more diverse interests and as strong feelings about the importance of their interests in the climate negotiations as they have now. So we've, for quite some time, have had the most vulnerable countries, particularly the small island states that are very low-lying and very vulnerable to sea level rise and severe weather, pushing for stronger action. But that chorus from them is being joined by the many in Africa, many other nations that are have not been as active in the negotiations. So the large emitters, the China, India's, Brazil's, Indonesia's, if you include the land use change, are finding more pressure from within their own negotiating bloc, because all of the developing countries coordinate their positions in these negotiations. They're finding more pressure from like-minded states and other states that are normally haven't been the ones pushing them, at least in the Kyoto process. So I think it's a little too early to see how that plays out. A good indicator of that will be the meeting that occurs in July in Japan after the G8 summit. This is the major emitters process that was launched by the Bush administration. I think you can't look at that as a test of whether China and India and other major developing country emitters are willing to do more, because there's a political rationale for their cutting a deal next year with a new American president. But nevertheless, the willingness to change the rhetoric around those conversations, I think, will be an important signal about what they're willing to do. Bali itself provided forward movement of reading the tea leaves that the language suggests conditionality of action, that whereas the position of developing countries in the Kyoto process was no way, you go first, you cause this problem, after you show leadership, we'll think about it. The language that was agreed to last year, and it says that the developing countries will take action, but it's conditioned on measurable, quantifiable financial assistance and capacity building assistance from developed countries. So that willingness to consider action is evidence so far. Precisely how that action is manifested and how it would be captured by an international agreement and whether it would be legally binding, I think we don't know yet. And so the July meeting, probably more than the annual conference that will occur in December of this year, will, I think, signal where that's going. But really, I think we'll have to wait till next year to really know the answer. The second question was about enforceability of congressional executive agreements. From a domestic and an international standpoint, a treaty and a congressional executive agreement has the same effect. Domestically, it has the same force as a federal statute, because it is, and a treaty under the Constitution is considered to have the same status as a federal statute. Internationally, they're both considered to be legally binding agreements, so our international negotiating partners should have absolutely no preference whatsoever as to how we choose to handle the agreement for purposes of our domestic internal political review. So it's really a question for the United States to decide, for the Congress and the President to decide, without an international implication. I think the international community would welcome any change in the review process that would increase the likelihood of U.S. participation. So the international perspective ought to be favorable. The question about R&D figures, I don't know how much is appropriate. I was just trying to look at the previous spikes in U.S. R&D spending that might be analogous. So in order to get us up in real dollar terms to the high level of spending that we had in the energy area at the tail end of the Carter administration, we would need a $10 to $15 billion increase. Also, if you look at, again, in real dollars, the amount of money that the U.S. spent on the Apollo project or the Strategic Defense Initiative in the Reagan administration, or what we are now committing to the war on terror, not Iraq, but the narrower war on terror, the domestic homeland security, perhaps is a better way of saying that, then that figure would approximate the amount that has been mobilized for these political challenges that arise and need to be addressed in a relatively defined time period. So what I take away from that, I don't know how much is needed, but I take away as a little bit more of a political person that that's at the scale of something that ought to be doable because we've done that in the past.
I'll take a quick slice at these two questions: the congressional executive agreements and the R&D funding issue. I agree. Congressional executive agreements. In fact, the examples you gave, I hadn't really thought about this very much. The examples you gave, the congressional executive agreements seem to me to be a lot more even detailed than the treaties in terms of, and we're talking about something that's pretty detailed here. I think one of the challenges that will emerge quickly for the concept of using congressional executive agreements for this purpose. Obviously, there will be a group of people in the United States Senate who never want to share with the House, and so there's that problem. And there's people who will want this thing to require 67 votes because of their ideological predisposition and aren't going to want to have a 51 voter on something like this. Obviously, there is a fair amount of angst built up in the congressional system in recent years about fast-track procedures for trade agreements, and that I think will spill over into this discussion. People, I think, may have sort of initial negative gut reactions to saying, "Well, I mean, we're going to do this whole thing in a kind of a sort of in a expedited procedure." And although if you sit back and think about it, it's kind of hard to see how you get there from here with a fully amendable kind of product. Still, I think that's going to take a fair amount of thought by people, and ultimately, as most things in Congress and Washington, it's going to turn on sort of the level of trust that's in the system. We don't have a whole lot of trust kind of floating around the system right now on most any topic, and so I think that one of the crucial aspects of getting it done, period, but certainly getting it done this way, will be to come up with a sufficient degree of institutional trust between key actors on the Hill and with key actors in the executive branch that they'll be able to contemplate something like that. And that's going to be, I think, that's going to be tough because, like I said, we're not in a real happy trust environment right now in any direction. With respect to R&D funding, I do think that that's a really important question. How to size it obviously needs to be way more than what we're doing now if we're going to have any grip on this problem in any real way. The kinds of budgets that we have been producing for energy research and development, and again, this is clearly not a political thing because the Clinton administration was just as bad on setting up good energy R&D budgets as the Bush administration was. It's been since the 80s, energy R&D budgets had been pretty miserably bad. I think there's a lot of congressional interest now. We added a lot in the omnibus appropriations bill. We added a lot to the request that the president had. So there's a real bipartisan congressional appetite for higher budgets, and that's in energy, and that's a really good sign. This report that I mentioned, this Energy Technology Perspectives 2008 by the International Energy Agency, you can Google it. It's mostly about R&D. After they sort of get through the scenario analysis, they pick 17 research and development areas and drill down to some degree. There aren't full-fledged technology roadmaps by any means, but they drill down into them. One of the problems that we're going to have in boosting R&D funding here is, look, we can appropriate lots of dough out of Congress. The question is, can you spend it effectively? And I I have a non-academic rule of thumb that if you really want to screw up a federal program, R&D program, just keep giving it 100% increases every year because they just can't, they can't spend it that well that fast. And there probably aren't enough good ideas that sort of, out there. There's a real capacity building issue in our energy and R&D system in this country that is going to be, I think, a very significant factor in figuring out how fast we can ramp these budgets up in a sustainable way where we're just not, setting ourselves up for lots of GAO and Inspector General reports, 6 years down the road.
I'd like to talk about the budget. I think that the idea of marrying the charges that you're getting, something like a pipes charge, it would be the sale of these permits. Taking that money and earmarking it for R&D is a terrible idea. I think it's bad economically, bad politically, and it won't work. And I'll give you my 3 reasons why. Okay? And I understand that the reason that it's attractive is it looks like a lot of money, and we want a lot of money. But we've done this at the state level, at a large number of states. There's earmarked funds that are coming in. They're mostly have come in on the deregulatory bills in California. There's quite a lot of money that's earmarked for R&D budgets. But the state budgets work very differently. And at the federal level, what you're going to find, if this money is automatically given to a bureaucracy without the oversight in Congress and doesn't have the political support, that they might not wind up getting it anyway. Okay, that is to say, you don't wind up with agencies that are as independent as something like the California Energy Commission can do according to the entire structure of the way the government is set up. And, yeah, the Federal Reserve can get its own money because they print it. But they also don't need an appropriation. They don't need an authorization. It's not part of the executive budget. It's not part of the executive branch. So if the Department of Energy or ARPA-E had this money, okay, and the president didn't want to spend it, and Congress had lost interest in it, then I don't think that it would work in order to provide the stability that we're talking about anyway. We have to think of a different issue in terms of stability. Now, my other 2 points, on the political side, I would say, here's all this money, let's put it into the general budget so everybody gets a shot at it. What's happened in Europe with their very high gasoline prices, taxes, is that it has become an absolutely critical part of the financial structure of these countries. And they're not about to get rid of them. And they're having riots now over trying to lower the taxes because of the high prices. And I think it's going to take a while before they pull it off. In my own state of California, where we have a nice hefty sales tax on gasoline, it's coming in with some major dollars this year. And it's going to make a real dent in the budget crisis that we're having. And nobody has mentioned cutting the gasoline tax. And if it were all going to something like energy R&D, you can be sure they would look at this and say, what is the Energy Commission doing with $4 billion? Let's have a tax cut. So I think that you definitely, from a political point of view, want that money going into everybody's pot so that they get a stake in it. On the economic side, the charges for those permits should be related to the externality costs associated with carbon dioxide emissions, whereas the expenditures for the program should be related to the technological opportunities, to the amount of money that we can spend at any given time without it being a waste. It's a completely different set of criteria that we should be using. So those 2 policies should not be joined, and I'm really opposed to it. There's a famous article that Austin Goolsbee, who is, I believe, Senator Obama's chief economic advisor now, he's a professor at the University of Chicago, that he wrote in the 1980s about what happened to the enormous amount of R&D, that the big buildup under Reagan. I guess it was the early 90s that this piece came out. Large R&D build-up, mostly for military, under Reagan. And largely what happened was a lot of professor salaries went up. It pretty much all went into labor, and very little went into any increase in innovation or productivity. So you really have to be careful with dramatic run-ups in funds.
And there's a timing effect here, too, because most of the dough is going to come in 10, 15 years from now, and all the R&D, it needs to go up right away. So I think that's there's sort of allowances to or auction revenue to R&D. That there's a timing problem there too.
Great. So makes a lot of sense. I would just highlight a few challenges we've had the other way. So, for example, the Bush administration has proposed spending over the next 3 years $2 billion to assist China and other rapidly emerging developing countries to grow more cleanly. And it made that proposal from the Treasury Department with, to my understanding, very little consultation with the Congress. I think not any clear expectation that there would be appropriations. When we talk about international cooperation on the environment, we have a pattern of the president making commitments internationally. They're non-binding, but nevertheless they create very strong expectations among other countries, and the Congress saying, well, that wasn't our commitment, and going a very different route. So look at the funding for the Global Environment Facility, which is an instrument that grew out of the Climate Change Convention and out of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. The U.S. has been well over $100 million in arrears on that. It's been a major struggle to get congressional support for that. So I understand the timing point. I understand the concern. But we also can't just assume that because it's a good idea that the Congress will be funding it, and so
or
that the president will be asking for it. That's right. So I think there's an even broader challenge here.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to mention one other thing about budgets. While the Energy Information Administration has just come out with an analysis of federal subsidies for energy, and it turns out in real terms, the energy subsidy, the way they've calculated, from 1999 to 2006 actually increased from 10 to almost $17 billion. The reason these numbers look really different than what you're thinking is because it used to be that 30% of it was a little more, 35%, about a third, was in tax expenditures, and most of those were actually subsidies for oil depreciation allowances. And now the tax expenditures account for $8 billion out of that $17 billion. In other words, 2/3 of the support from the federal government for energy now comes through tax cuts, not through direct expenditures.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say, and I think it goes back to the point of collegiality and trust, because there is one shining example of an international commitment that was sort of processed. It came about a different way and has been very stable, and that's PEPFAR. I mean, that's the AIDS funding for Africa. I mean, that was a situation where at the front end there really was kind of a shared sort of commitment and passion by both the president and key people in Congress, and that sort of shows you how it can work. I mean, that's an excellent example of how you ought to do it, and that is not just to sort of go have a signing ceremony in some foreign capital saying we're going to have an energy cooperation agreement with you, and then come home and say, oh, by the way. I think that looking to that model of how that happened, and I think that there is enough interest and passion in energy research in Congress that you could have that kind of dialogue and those kinds of shared commitments.
I think one more round. Okay, one more round of questions. Lisa, right up here. We'll move to the back.
Yeah, my question is for Dr. Simon. My name is Alan Weinstein. I'm just representing myself. I'm wondering, you paint a rather gloomy picture on congressional progress for such a societally important issue. I'm wondering, is there any precedent in the past for an equally pressing societal issue that faced so many roadblocks? And if so, how did they overcome those roadblocks in the past?
We have a question in the back. Was there a hand raised? Right in the aisle there.
I'm David Van Hoogstraten from Hunton & Williams, and I wondered just if Nigel could respond to some of the points that Bob Simon raised about a number of the difficulties of doing this as a congressional executive agreement rather than as a treaty. And I'd just add one other, which is sort of the notion that the reason treaties require 2/3 of the Senate to concur is that they're tough, big issues that lots of people care about. I mean, I look at the Versailles Treaty as an example where Wilson really did end up killing himself trying to sell that to the American people, and in the end was not successful in doing so. But what would you say to those who would argue, well, there's a Democratic president, a Democratic Congress, a Democratic Senate. Don't we need the check or the balance provided by a 2/3 Senate vote to make sure that something isn't rammed through? And even though it may be constitutional, might there not be a public outcry akin to, say, what there was when Roosevelt attempted to expand the size of the Supreme Court, for example? Perfectly legal to try to do, but politically it was a very tough sell.
Just pass the mic down into the row over there.
Thank you. I'm Chris Hill at George Mason. This is a question for Bob Simon, I guess, and it'll have a spillover to Linda. It has to do with a comment you made, Bob, about the entitlements that were created, or expectation of entitlement created during the recent negotiations. And that raises a specter of what a number of us have worried about, which is that in the end, a cap-and-trade allocation system will become probably the mother of all pork barrel operations. And after it does that, it will then become the most corrupt program the government has ever seen. So if there's any validity to those propositions, despite the difficulty, might not it make more sense at this critical juncture in political change to put back on the table the much cleaner, neater, easier to manage, all the economists get unemployed and go away, we don't need these studies anymore, if we do a tax bill rather than cap and trade?
Who wants to go first? I guess everyone's looking at me. Well, let me just start with Alan Weinstein's question first. Yeah, I can think of two: Social Security and Medicare. I mean, I think we have risen to large, sort of multi-decadal societal challenges. Not very often. I mean, maybe once every 50 years. So maybe we're about due. They're very difficult. I think if you sort of look at sort of the history of either of those, none of them, they both required a very strong presidential leadership, and very strong partnership between the executive and the legislative branch to get them done. Both of them probably didn't work the first time around either. Most big bills that we do in Congress, and they don't have to be of this magnitude. Most big bills that I can think of kind of croak the first time through anyway, and that's sort of the natural part of the education process in Congress. I mean, something that's a truly novel idea. A lot of people are going to approach with some real caution, and the proponents aren't going to get it right either the first time because they're still climbing a learning curve. They're just like the proverbial assistant professor who's a couple pages ahead of the students going through the course, right? So we've seen this. I mean, I've worked on a lot of bills in my years on the Hill, where the first time around, it seemed like a really stupid idea, and you couldn't get any support. Next Congress, everybody had kind of figured it out and warmed to it, and then we learned some things ourselves, and you were able to sort of have a much more, your success the second time around, you wouldn't have expected it based on the reaction everybody had the first time around. So I mean, I don't think that it's I don't think that if you're sort of evaluating the difficulties ahead of you, you're necessarily being excessively gloomy. This is stuff that we have done this kind of thing in the past, and we do have. I think the good thing about the Senate, at least, and I think the same thing is true generally of the House, is that you have on both sides of the aisle in the Senate a lot of people who actually do want to make a viable system like this work, and you probably have 60 votes in the Senate today of people who want a cap-and-trade system of some kind. Now, you clearly don't have 60 votes, anywhere near 60 votes, for what we were talking about, but that's okay. A lot of people went through that debate, and it made them crystallize their thinking on the matter, and I think there's some real progress in that. And I think I would imagine that a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, amidst all the sturm and drang, were doing some careful listening of what people were and weren't saying about it. And I do think that there is in the Senate. I'm confident from the conversations I've had with people, sort of over the years on this, is that you've got a lot of people who do see this as a serious problem and do want to take a serious run at it. And so I think that's that is a very non-gloomy thing, and I think that's what sort of is going to keep the momentum going for this for next year. I think Chris has got a good point about the perils of an allocation system. Obviously, you can. I think it's a bit of too much of a dichotomy between the allocation system that becomes the most corrupt pork barrel in history and a tax. People tend to have, I think, in my own personal view, magical thinking about the tax approaches to it. They say, well, wouldn't a tax be nice and clean and simple? And I say, well, show me one nice, clean, simple section of the U.S. tax code, and we can have a conversation. Because once you get down into the details of it, the same dynamics work either way. There are lots of very, very complex architecture around seemingly simple propositions in the U.S. tax code, and so I don't think you're magically immune in either part of the United States Code. I do think that I think it's just as a matter of necessity for any kind of climate change legislation to be passed, it's going to have to be pretty simple and transparent to a lot of people, and whether it's a cap and trade or something else. I think just as a necessity in order to get people to feel sufficient confidence that they understand what they're voting for, it will have to be something that is relatively streamlined, that is that most provisions of it look directly on point. Those are the characteristics that I think it will ultimately embody, and I think that we'll probably get there.
I want to entirely concur with what you just said about taxes. The Energy Policy Act of 2000, the latest one, 5, is riddled with pork barrel tax provisions. It is just extraordinary, and I would argue that it's even worse than the pork barrel that you get in direct expenditures for a couple of reasons. First of all, you can't even find out who's getting the money because people's tax returns are confidential. So you get into a tax bill and it's gone. I mean, presumably the staffer who put it in knows who's getting the benefit, but nobody else will ever find out.
Maybe not even him.
Okay, and then on top of that, people wind up going to the Treasury Department to get their deduction or their credit qualified. And is our friend from OMB still here? Okay, in any event, I will tell you a story about one thing that happened last year when some of these bills came in, and the people at the Treasury Department had no idea what they were looking at because they didn't know how windmills worked or what was a new technology or what was an old technology, and they couldn't get Finally, OMB insisted that they bring in PPNL the next time they have the next round on how those tax incentives are going to work. But what you can wind up with in a tax bill is all that pork barrel plus no accountability is the way it works out. So it's really unfortunate. The idea of something like a value-added tax for carbon is wonderful.
You get the last word.
Thank you, Ray. Well, David invited me to comment on Bob's thoughts on congressional executive agreements and then to address the potential political pitfalls of going that route in the context of a democratically controlled Congress and a potentially democratically controlled White House. I've thought that Bob's summary of the difficulties that this policy recommendation that I'm making was excellent. He talked about the lack of trust that exists and how that's really important to establish, and that what is done in the trade context will have some spillover effects, both in terms of what has been done in the past as well as what is done in the future. I agree with that completely. I would just point out that one thing that a well-designed congressional executive agreement mechanism could do would be to include mechanisms that would build trust. Mm-hmm. So mandatory consultations and reporting and formal observer groups so that there is a group in the Congress that is very aware of the negotiating dynamic and of what is the best kind of international agreements that the U.S. can negotiate, and therefore is willing to be a champion for the best deal possible. I think that those kinds of mechanisms could be very helpful in building trust. Jealousy between the Senate in terms of its prerogatives and letting the House in, and also just losing the 67 vote and moving it down to 60 for cloture. Those are very valid points. I would note that the committee that it would be most affected is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, with both Senator Lugar and Biden having voted for McCain-Lieberman and voting for cloture on Lieberman-Warner, and who I think even from a more of a foreign policy perspective and less of a climate perspective, understand that reintegrating the United States in multilateral climate negotiations is one of the things that a new administration and Congress need to do in order to repair some of the damage that has been done to U.S. standing in the world and our relationships with Europe and other key allies. And so that there could be a positive political dynamic that's unrelated to climate change that makes the committee that might otherwise be most concerned about that approach willing to go a route that would be instrumental and have a positive outcome from their standpoint. In terms of the political reaction, I think it really depends on the content of what the negotiating principles are. If the agreed upon negotiating objectives for the United States are to the liking of energy-intensive industries, then this becomes a shield against a bad agreement as much as if it were a vehicle for bringing about U.S. participation in a good agreement. So it all really, I think, not all, but a major component here on the political acceptability is what does the Congress say an agreement needs to include? And the interest groups and stakeholders that are actively involved in shaping the domestic legislation would presumably have as active a presence and voice in that process. And so I would hope that we would be more likely to thread the needle as a result of, in terms of getting the U.S. into an agreement that was internationally acceptable and domestically acceptable because of that advanced active participation in defining the objectives. And so this mechanism, I think, provides reason to think that the political support could very well be there if the negotiating objectives were articulated appropriately. Finally, there may very well be the case that some folks really hate this approach, but ultimately it comes down to votes. And I would just note that if an amendment to do it this way is offered in the context of a debate on a cap-and-trade bill, you only need 51 votes to have that amendment accepted. And then ultimately you'll need 60 votes on the cloture, but I would just imagine that the senator's decision to vote for a bill or against a bill will be based much more on the overall cost to the constituency and other things that will be driving it rather than the coordination mechanism between the Congress and the President and the legalities of how an international agreement would be considered. So really to get to yes for a congressional executive agreement vote, you need I think in the context of a cap and trade, you need a simple majority. And that's really quite different from 67 votes, which of course a treaty requires. The 67th senator is twice as liberal or conservative as the 50th senator, according to various objective indicators of this put out by think tanks around town. And so that's a major difference. So if you can get to 51 for congressional executive, it may be that 49 really hate it, but it doesn't matter.
Thank you, Nigel. Please join me in thanking this panel for Dr. Billy, just briefly here.
Yeah, we changed the schedule just a little bit, as you probably noticed. This panel went a little bit late, and I'm just going to offer some quick concluding remarks and get you out of here not only on time, perhaps just a few minutes early. What I thought I'd do just briefly is recap, at the risk of simplifying and getting it wrong, recap some of the big points. I mean, we started off this morning with this idea that we were going to talk about how to inform the design. Well, originally it was really focused on the targets. That was what we told EPA we were going to do. But we kind of got more broad as we began talking about the other issues that would filter into thinking about a target, in particular the technology issues and the participation issues. But what I took away from the first panel was at some level what the U.S. emissions actually are over some 20, 30, 40-year time period are actually not so important for the global mitigation result as the technology assumptions are, and in particular what happens in other countries. So we shouldn't think about our mitigation goal just as how many tons are going to be reduced. It really needs to be thought of in terms of what are the technologies it's going to encourage and what are the actions from other countries that are going to result. The second panel dove into a number of other interesting questions. The one thing that I thought was obvious or really kind of jumped out at me, aside from the importance of technology once again, was these issues of offsets. And one point that didn't come up that I wish had come up a little bit more was the offsets have a huge impact on the costs for a fixed target. But presumably you could turn that around and say, well, if you allow more offsets, maybe you could have a different target in the same costs. And thinking about how that may filter into the first question, which is how much action can we get in other countries. One of the very interesting points I thought that Howard and a couple other people made was that the design of the policy could have important consequences for the technology development, not just in the traditional ways we think about. For those of us who've done research on
inciting technology, but also just in terms of the games people might play. And this idea that you might have a target that everybody agrees on, but then after the target is passed, people might be going for a whole different set of technological developments than they said when they started the process, which might drive up the costs. And importantly, this siting issue, which came back actually in the last panel with some of Bob's comments, that if we don't deal with how we're actually going to transmit electricity and where we're going to build these power plants, these nuclear power plants and these CCS plants, that may be a large issue unto itself. And then the final panel was kind of an interesting mix. Originally, I think I had kind of imagined that we might talk about how the setting of the target would actually influence technology development and international participation. What we ended up talking about a little bit more was how we could build those elements into a bill, and less about how the target would affect them. But I thought Nigel's discussion about how a congressional executive agreement might work, and in particular how it might be used to empower negotiators to get more out of the international negotiations. Now, I think what we heard in the discussion actually was that it isn't just having a congressional executive agreement. What really seems to matter is having Congress and the President basically on the same page to some extent in terms of what they're trying to get out of the negotiations, so that once something is negotiated, it actually does become law, either because of a congressional executive agreement or because of this consensus that has been built up ahead of time. Clearly, from Linda's discussion, it's very important that we figure out how to pay for these technologies. The traditional model of having the early adopters, or at least some discriminated against group of people, whoever those guys or gals are, paying more for the technology initially, whether that model exactly works or whether or not it's going to have to be public policy through subsidies or some other mechanism that supports those that early technology deployment is going to be really critical. And then I think Bob's comments about the political realities, on the one hand, were sobering, but as he came back at the end, I think he described that there actually is a lot of reason for optimism, if for no other reason than a lot of really important senators out there are very concerned about this issue and seem determined to try to figure out a way forward. Perhaps the main issue is really having leadership. And while that was one of his obstacles, certainly it's something we're all looking forward to, hopefully, in the future. If I tried to sum all this up into a couple of bullet points, one is that I think the target is perhaps there are a couple of reasons for optimism about the targets. One was the comment that I think Jake or somebody made in the very first panel about how already we're seeing the example in Europe of being able to have a high price on CO2, at least higher than I would have ever thought possible, and things aren't crumbling. People aren't screaming in the streets, at least yet. But they're looking at 27, I think we heard yesterday from someone that's like 27 euros a ton of CO2 right now, and they are continuing on. So whether or not it's that example or the idea that we can have some sort of competitiveness mechanism built into the bill gives some optimism. The second idea is that these targets might be constructed with a conditionality of the sort that Nigel mentioned. And I thought that he made a number of points that were very interesting and convincing for me. One was the idea that having this sort of congressional executive agreement and having it built into an international agreement would give a lot more confidence to the private sector that this policy was here to stay and that these prices were here to stay. And indeed, even if you had a conditionality built into a statute or a bill in a domestic policy, that if everybody else did something, we would go much more aggressive. People might actually begin to believe that condition was going to be met just because of the strength of the U.S. Position. So I think I'm actually fairly optimistic that we can come to agreement on targets, if for no other reason that the important aspect of the targets is really driving the international effort. Also, obviously, technology has to be an important part of this. I don't think we actually came to a lot of conclusions about exactly how to do that, except that it's going to be hard. We need to deal with the agencies, and we need to deal with leadership on that issue. And then the last piece that I walked away with, realizing was perhaps more important than I thought of before, was just all these siting and infrastructure problems that if we don't deal with them at some point are really going to probably come back to bite us. So let me just wrap everything up by, first of all, thanking our sponsors, the Climate Economics branch at EPA. Hopefully you'll be seeing, or you will be seeing, some additional workshops coming out of their grant to us. I also want to mention that for those of you who are not familiar with RFF, we actually have quite a bit of research ongoing in this area. There's a project with Joe Aldi looking at international agreements, and a project that Ray has looking at foreign policy. We're looking at adaptation and forest carbon, which came up during the conversations. So I'd really encourage you to follow up with us individually or check our website, which will be redesigned soon, and hopefully make it easier to find everything. And one other thing I should mention, we just did this huge project that ended in November looking at the design of domestic policy, broken up into 15 really digestible pieces for you to consume, and that's all available on the web. And then lastly, we've really put a lot of effort into convening events. We had several workshops this year on cost containment, on the McKinsey report, on the CCSP report. We hope that people are enjoying those things. We'd encourage any feedback about whether we're hitting all the things that you guys are interested in. Our first Wednesday seminar just finished 2 weeks ago with this McKinsey study. That'll be picking back up in the fall. And obviously, we actually have a couple of upcoming workshops that haven't been scheduled. One we're talking about on competitiveness, another one on offsets. So keep your eye out for those things as well. Thank all of you guys for showing up and offering all of your very insightful comments, all of our millions of people watching on the web. And once again, I just ask you to give a hand to all of our participants today.